And now, live from San Francisco, it's Barbara Simpson on Hot Talk 560 KSFO.
Yes, if it's drums you hear, the babe is near. That's me. I'm Barbara Simpson, Babe in the Bunker, with you every weekend right here on KSFO 560 on your AM dial. Saturdays 5 to 7, Sundays 4 to 7. Hey, it's 4 o'clock. I'm here, you're there. We've got 3 hours and lots to talk about, lots to discuss. Listeners to my program know that I read a whole variety of publications, and one newspaper that I have gotten for many, many years it's called the Western Ag Reporter, published out of Billings, Montana. And I find it fascinating because there's a lot of information in there about what the government is doing, mainly to ranchers and farmers and to our food. You know, when you talk about the country of origin labeling, this is a battle that's been going on for a very long time. And there's a lot of information reported in that little newspaper that you're not going to find pretty much anywhere else. And I saw an article in there several weeks ago written by Karen Budd-Falen, who is, she's an attorney with the Budd-Falen law firm. And it's about federal government bullying and rural cleansing. And I thought, what is that about? Well, I read the article. And I found it fascinating because apparently there was going to be a congressional committee meeting at which they would be discussing this. And it was an angle of property rights that I will admit to you I was not aware of. And I suspect you don't know about it either. Now, you may say, well, what do I care? You know, I live in the Bay Area. I don't have a ranch. I don't have a farm, and I'm not going to. Well, there are people in our area who do have ranches, as a matter of fact. You drive around and you'll see cattle on the hills. They're not just wild cattle. Those are cattle owned by ranchers in our area. And if you like going into your supermarket or your local neighborhood grocery store and buying some hamburger or a steak or so, you should be concerned about those ranchers and that cattle, because that's where that meat comes from, whether you like to think about it or not. It does, and there's nothing wrong with it. And so we've been trying to get Karen Budd-Falen and my schedule together, and we finally did today. And she is on the line right now and going to give us a heads up on what on earth all this is about. Ms. Budd-Falen, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
I was very interested in the article that you wrote in the Western Ag Reporter, and you were talking about this issue of federal government bullying and rural cleansing, and in fact asking people to write to you and tell you about their experience with the feds and how the screws were put to them. So for the sake of just knowing what we're talking about, what do you mean when you say federal government bullying and rural cleansing? It sounds terribly ominous.
Basically, what has happened is that people who work for the federal government, federal employees, have complete immunity when they take action against a citizen individually. So, for example, it doesn't just apply to ranching, although that's basically what I represent and what I have is a ranch. It's when you have a federal employee that singles an individual out for adverse treatment and they use the power of their office against an individual. Mm-hmm. Right now, the courts do not allow you to sue that individual. Now, if you work for a state government or a county government or a city government, the Civil Rights Act would say that if you are bullying an individual, they could bring a civil suit against you in the federal court, and they would have a chance to go to a jury and prove their claim or not. But federal employees are completely immune from litigation. And so the point of this congressional hearing, and in fact we're going to have 2 other hearings, is to show why we need a way to bring our claims into court and have a judge and a jury determine if our claims of bullying or harassment are valid against individuals who work for the federal government, just like you could if you had the same problem with a state employee or a local employee.
How did we get to the point where the federal employee is, in essence, what you're saying is legally untouchable? He can do whatever he wants, and you can't hurt him.
Well, it's fairly long history. As I'm sure your listeners know, we brought most of our law over from England, and under the system in England, the king could do no wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so the American system of laws was set up based on that English model of the king could do no wrong. When the government was trying to grant, though, everyone in the nation voting rights, and you had it where African Americans and other minorities could not vote, the federal government passed the Civil Rights Act to waive the sovereign immunity if you had a poll worker stopping somebody from voting. And so that's why this sovereign immunity was waived for state employees and local employees. It was all based on the ability to vote. That act then, again, for state and federal employees, is sort of expanded, and the courts have determined that every constitutional guarantee is a civil rights, and so you can assert and protect your civil rights against state and local employees.
Mm-hmm.
But the Voting Act never applied to the federal government because there were never federal workers at these polling places. And so we are now seeking to change that law so that you have the same protection against the federal government as you do against state and local government.
Give me an example of what a federal worker could do to, say, me as a property owner that would come under this idea that you're talking about this federal bullying, and I would have no legal recourse to have my case heard, by supposedly an impartial panel.
The whole idea, I think, it's happened over a long period of time, but the court case that really highlighted everything was about a guy named Frank Robbins who owned a ranch in Wyoming, and I represented Frank. He had a BLM and Forest Service permits as well as a significant amount of private property in his ranch. The federal government decided that they wanted easement across his private property. Under the U.S. Constitution, if the government wants a property interest, they have to give you due process and pay you just compensation.
Right. But
these certain BLM employees decided they did not want to pay Mr. Robbins due process and just compensation. He just wanted Mr. Robbins to give them an easement across his private property. And when he said no, they tried to use the power of the federal government to just force him to give it up. They trespassed his livestock 26 times. They broke into a private home that he had that he ran his hunting out business out of. They charged him criminally with, quote, interfering with an officer in support of his duties. We had to have a criminal trial on that. He was acquitted by a jury in 20 minutes, which is the fastest federal acquittal ever in the state of Wyoming.
20 minutes, huh?
That is a very fast.
I would say.
It was a 3-day jury trial. It was right before Thanksgiving. It was horribly painful for his family. And because the federal government has got unlimited access to the courts and unlimited resources, they just kept bringing all of these claims and charges against him, hoping that eventually he would just say, forget it. You can have an easement. You can cross my property whenever you want to. But after 5 years, Mr. Robbins got really sick of all this harassment, and so he brought a case against them and tried to sue them individually. We were successful in the Wyoming Federal District Court, which is actually a very conservative court. We were then successful again in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. The federal government appealed it to the Supreme Court, and we lost in front of the Supreme Court on a split decision. The Supreme Court saying, we believe that Mr. Robbins had been harassed and that the government had been using their power against him. However, there is no law that allows you to sue these federal employees, so we are very sorry, but you cannot get to court. And so we never did get our day in court.
That's astonishing. We have to take a quick break. Hold your thought right there, and we'll come back and continue this discussion. If you're just joining us here on KSFO, we're speaking with attorney Karen Budd-Falen about this situation of your property rights, where you do not have the right to sue federal employees who are abusing your property rights. They can do essentially whatever they want, and the courts will not help you, and did not in this particular case, which went all the way to the Supreme Court. Barbara Simpson right here on KSFO. If you have a quick question for our guest, 808-5600. We are speaking with Karen Budd-Falen, who is an attorney. She served for 3 years in the Reagan administration, the U.S. Department of the Interior in Washington, as a special assistant to the Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals Management. And she also served as law clerk to the Assistant Solicitor for Water and Power, and has worked as an attorney for the Mountain States Legal Foundation. So she knows of what she speaks when we're talking about these land rights and issues facing ranchers and farmers. And I just find the whole story shocking that this situation even exists, that these people have zero ability to hold the federal employees responsible for any atrocious behavior. And you heard her example with the case that she handled dealing with Frank Robbins. What was the final outcome of that? Did he have to give the easement to the feds? It sounds like he did.
Well, he never did give the easement to the feds, but as punishment for that, he lost his ability to run half of his cattle herd.
Oh, so they took retribution against him.
Yes. And we were not able to go to court for that either.
Good grief. Now, you in your article that was in the Western Ag Reporter, you were asking people who have had examples of this type of thing happen to them to contact you, and they were going to be, a number of ranchers were going to be testifying at this first congressional hearing, which was held about a month and a half ago. What other kinds of stories did they talk about? What were the examples?
Oh, gosh,
just a couple.
We actually received lots of examples. One of the things in the West that is incredibly important is water rights,
right?
Because it doesn't rain in most of the West, and we have private property in our water, which the courts have recognized time and time again.
Mm-hmm.
Because water is so precious, though, the federal government also wants control of those water resources, because he who controls the water most of the time controls the land.
Okay.
So we got several cases where the federal government took people's water rights, either by fencing their livestock away from their water or piping their water to different places. We had quite a number of cases that we received where the federal government would take an action that they knew was wrong,
mm-hmm.
but ranchers testified in front of Congress that the Justice Department would say, we know we're wrong, however, we have significantly more resources than you do. We have more money, we have more time, and we will break you in administrative appeals, so you should just acquiesce to our demands.
They actually said that to people?
My father-in-law.
They actually said that to people?
Yes.
Talk about chutzpah. I mean,
the hard part is the Justice Department is the largest law firm in the world.
Yes.
And so when you're one small rancher with a law firm trying to go against the federal government that prints the money, normally with really radical environmental groups who are supporting the federal government's action to take you away from your land, it is very hard to fight that kind of power.
When you were dealing with Robbins, who was president at that time?
That was initially during the Bush administration.
Mm-hmm. The first Bush or second Bush? Do you remember?
It would have been second Bush.
Second Bush. Okay. That's okay.
Remember, that's a long time ago.
I know. I didn't mean to put you on the spot on the date, but I was just wondering, it seems to me, and I don't own a ranch. I mean, so I'm going by what I read and what I know and where my heart is for these people, because I'm very much in favor of property rights. This ties in with the power of the EPA to come down on people too, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, so we are being set up where the feds have all the power, as you said. They have all the legal power behind them, and they are not shy about telling you, we'll break you if you try to fight us. And for the little guy, you don't have a chance.
Well, and I can't say, I mean, I've worked in this area for 30 years. And so I can't really say that I think this is a Republican or Democrat issue, because at least in these kind of cases, more often it is the local federal guy who gets a taste of power, and he can enforce his power, and they're not necessarily tied to one administration or the other. When you're talking about things, though, like rulemaking, like the EPA's latest rulemaking, trying to make everything possible a wetland or waters of America so that it can regulate them, that does seem to sort of ebb and flow with environmental groups litigating against the federal government and then getting friendly suits so that the federal government then can take additional power over property rights.
Well,
you do see that with administrations.
Right. I've done a couple of programs on people and attorneys representing clients who are, where they have a piece of desert land and suddenly the feds come in and say, no, that's a wetland, so you can't do anything with it. This kind of thing is going on a lot. And again, it's below the radar. It doesn't get in the New York Times. It doesn't get on your national news. And these people are being squeezed. Now, you talked about this business of rural cleansing. What do you mean by that?
When you look at rural areas, these rural areas are based on agriculture communities, whether you're talking about ranches in Nevada or Wyoming or Idaho or rice farms in Arkansas. What ties together and what holds together these rural areas, with the very few exceptions of places like Jackson, Wyoming, where they can make money because they're pretty, when you have the federal government and these radical environmental groups in concert with the federal government taking businesses away, it really is rural cleansing. If you look at the websites of some of these radical environmental groups, who, by the way, are paid by the federal government to stop private property use, then you're not just harming Frank Robbins Ranch, you're harming the entire rural fabric of Thermopolis, Wyoming.
Yeah.
When Frank bought his ranch, he also had a guest ranch business, kind of a city slickers kind of deal, and he does, hunting. He was one of the largest employers in the county, Hot Springs County, Wyoming. He had 15 people. I mean, that's what this is. And when the federal government went after Frank, not only did he lose half of his cattle herd and his guest ranch business, he lost all of his employees because he couldn't afford to pay them anymore. That's a huge drain on rural economies. And so one of the ladies that testified at the hearing was a rancher who's also the county treasurer in Owyhee County, Idaho, and she talked about what happens when the federal government goes after these ranchers and how that translates down into huge economic costs for the counties because of the loss of property rights.
What is the goal of the federal government at this point to, as they say, return the land to nature, get the human footprint off of the land? Is that essentially what it is, or is that too simplistic?
No, I think it's that. There's a lot of people who are just assuming that use of the land, that economic use is a bad thing, and so there is a big pressure to eliminate any kind of economic use because that capitalism is just seen as bad,
right?
And I think that's some of the push. I think some of the push is to get rid of these rural areas and force people into larger metropolitan areas because people are easier to control in large metropolitan areas than we are scattered out throughout the country.
Right.
Particularly ranchers and farmers because we are so independent. I mean, you have to be when you don't have neighbors. You have to be very self-sustaining and independent, and there is a movement in this country that doesn't like that kind of feeling.
No question about it. And it's for them, for people who live like that, it's a survival thing. You are totally dependent on yourself and your family and the people on your ranch to survive.
Well, that's the way it was. I grew up on a ranch in western Wyoming, and that's how we lived.
Yeah.
And it's the fabric of this country. So it is actually really painful to sort of watch this transition when people simply don't appreciate that for one thing, the Constitution protects our ability to own our property. It's a guarantee in the Constitution.
That's what we thought.
We're also feeding the nation.
Yeah, but that's what we thought, that the Constitution guaranteed it. But this is a major loophole.
It is a major loophole. It's against the entire fabric of the Constitution. The Constitution was set up because it was to protect the citizen from the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've really forgotten that. They actually don't teach you that in law school. I think kids aren't taught that. They don't understand that the citizens aren't to serve the government. It's the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we really have to get back to that understanding if we're ever going to get anywhere in this country.
Now, you said there are going to be a couple more committee hearings coming up. Can you stay a few more minutes and tell me about those committee hearings and roughly when they'll be and what the outcome is hoped to be? Can you stay with us?
Yes.
Okay, let me put you on hold again. Don't hang up, and we will be right back. If you're just joining us, we're speaking with attorney Karen Budd-Falen. She's talking about the very real situation. And I'll be honest with you, folks, until I read this article in the Western Ag Reporter, I had no idea that this situation exists. That you, as a property owner, whether you have something in Contra Costa County, where you're running some cattle on some land out there, or whether you have a rice farm in the Central Valley, or whether you are in Wyoming or Montana and you have a big spread, if you have a federal employee who tries to do something that will ultimately mean you will lose the right to use your land or maybe lose your land, you have no legal recourse against them. Did you know that? I didn't know that, and we're finding out about that with my guest right here on KSFO. 808-5600. I'm Barbara Simpson. Barbara Simpson here on Hot Talk 560 KSFO. My guest is Karen Budd-Falen. We're talking about the situation dealing with the rights of property owners against the federal government, or at least against people working for the federal government who have the power of the federal government and the clout of the Justice Department behind them. And can't beat that. Sort of like the insurance companies. You try to sue an insurance company, and they've got all the lawyers, they've got all the money, and they've got all the time. And that's one of the things that's happening. Karen, let me ask you, this committee, for the first hearing, as I understand, was in late October, and you said there are a couple of others scheduled. Do you know dates of when they are and where, and what would be the outcome of it? What committee is going to be hearing this, and what can they do?
The first hearing was in front of the House Resources Committee.
Mm-hmm.
Rob Bishop from Utah was the chairman, and it was in late October. 2 other hearings are scheduled, one of them at the end of January, 1st of February, until they get back from Christmas break. We won't know the exact date. And then another one in March. They've also asked to put together legislation that would waive the immunity of these federal employees, and we are actually writing that now. And so the goal of the hearings is to highlight these problems and then work with the Congress to actually write legislation to fix these issues.
Do you have
so that at least you can have your day in court?
Absolutely. And that's, to me, that's the terrible part of it, is that you don't even have the opportunity to do that. Do you have a sense of the thinking of Congress in this? Senate, House, any people in particular? Or is there sympathy for the property owners?
Yeah, so actually it was very interesting because I testified at the first hearing. It started out fairly partisan with the Republicans wanting to protect private property and the liberal Democrats just thinking that this was about property.
Mm-hmm.
But once people were able to understand that this is simply wanting a day in court, we actually had some much greater sympathy and understanding from the Democrats as well, because they also believe that you should be able to go to court. Whether you win or lose is completely beside the point, but
right.
At least we should open the courthouse door. And so we did get some very positive remarks from some of the most liberal on the committee to say that they would actually work with us and talk with us and try to come up with language. We don't want this so you can sue every federal employee every time, the guy looks at you wrong.
Right.
But to come up with a narrowly tailored law so that in these instances of bullying where this harassment just goes on and on and on, that you have your day in court. And I think we'll get there. I was very enthused by the time that hearing was over.
Well, that makes me feel more positive about it, because I must admit I have somewhat of a jaded view of what goes on in Washington. In terms of what effect does this type of thing, this cleansing of rural areas, in other words, in essence, in many cases, putting these ranchers and farmers out of business, what does that do to our food supply?
It does a couple of things. One of them is going to drive up food prices.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, Americans only spend about a fraction of their disposable income on food.
Mm-hmm.
And if you dry up the supply of food, it is going to raise the cost. The other thing that I quite honestly think is more concerning is right now the health standards and food safety standards in the United States exceed every single other nation. People are going to have to eat somehow or the other. And if we don't keep our food sources in America, where we have very, very high food safety standards, we're going to start importing. And you're going to import from countries that don't have near the standards that we do, that do not have near the workplace safety that we do, that do not have near of the requirements that we do, and I think your food supply is not going to be near as safe as it is now.
Just as a side question on this, are you involved in the legal battle to try to get the country of origin labeling put in place, so that we know that when I get a pound of hamburger, that it's from American cattle and not from 18 other countries? I mean, I bought a pound of hamburger one time. Actually, I bought it for my dogs. It just looked like really nice hamburger. But I happened to turn the package over when I got it home, quite by accident, and noticed that they had listed the countries that meat had come from. And I think there were 7 different countries were represented in that one silly pound of ground beef.
That's actually not surprising. Particularly when you're talking about ground beef and lower cuts.
Yeah.
I have not been involved in the litigation. I can tell you, though, that our law firm is very much supportive of country of origin labeling, because I think the American public has the right to know.
Yeah, I agree with you on that.
That way consumers can have the choice. And if you don't care, then that's your choice. And if you do care, then you should have that option, because right now not knowing, I think, is a disservice to the American public. I
think you're absolutely right. I've got a couple of people on the line with questions for you. Let's go first to Orlean, is calling us from Santa Rosa. Orlean, do you have a question for my guest, Karen Budd-Falen, here on KSFO?
Yes, I do. I actually met you, Karen, when you were speaking up in Siskiyou County with those 8 wonderful constitutional sheriffs standing up fighting against the bringing down of the Siskiyou dams. And I just wondered if you could give us an update on what has happened, and if this also would come under the legal standing that you can't stand up against a federal agent in court.
They're sort of related in that much of what I try to do with the law firm here is to support the Constitution, mm-hmm. because the Constitution is what the foundation of this country is. And so part of what the sheriffs were doing in Siskiyou County is raising awareness on what the Constitution is and what it means. In that case, we were concerned about federal agency intrusion instead of an individual person's intrusion. And in that case, we're working with local governments, because local governments have the authority to stand up and force the federal government to deal with them on these local issues. So it's a huge push, and part of what we're doing is to get local governments to stand up and say, you cannot just simply do this in our county without coming through us first, without understanding the people and our economics. And who
Wait. Orlean, don't talk over her. Karen, finish your thought there, please. You cannot come in and do this over our authority, is what you're saying.
Over the authority of the local government. Federal statutes give local governments the authority to participate in federal agency action. The problem is most local governments don't know what their authority is, and so we teach these classes and work with local governments to teach them what kind of authority they have in dealing with the federal agencies.
What a
and
good
it's
idea.
not just bowing down and hoping they'll do the right thing for you, because I'm not sure that they will.
No, and Orlean, did you have one final quick question?
Yes, I was so impressed with your talk in Siskiyou County and all of those sheriffs, and I just wondered if you have had success in stopping the bringing down of the Siskiyou dams.
They have not taken out the dams yet.
Okay.
That's wonderful.
And I don't think, there's never just one decision where the government says, oh, gosh, we're sorry, we will go away.
Never.
But the longer you can push on them, the more people understand that they can stand up and be counted, then the less likely these things are to happen down the road.
Thank you for bringing that up, Orlean. I appreciate that. And let's go quickly to Phil in San Jose. You have a quick question for my guest, Karen Budd-Falen on KSFO.
Yes, I'm actually a member of her group, and I had read about an outrageous example. This rancher had come across this stream. He hadn't been by it in a long time, and I guess there was a little animal crossing. And in the meantime, a log had gone up against this little bridge and formed a lake. So he took the log out, to get the stream going again, and he was sued. I think it was by the feds, and they just put him through holy heck. And it's just incredible what the feds do to these people. And also, if she could comment, I know the Sackett case, they won, but I understand this was another property case in the Supreme Court. They won, but I think they're still being fined millions of dollars. Is she familiar with that or either of those cases?
Thank you for bringing that up, Phil. Isn't the Sackett case the one where the people had the dry land and the feds came in and said it was a wetland?
Yes.
Yeah, because I had that on my program. I remember talking about that. Can you stay a few more minutes? Let me put you on hold. We'll take a quick break, and we come back. You can just expound on what Phil brought up there, and I really appreciate that. We're talking with my guest, Karen Budd-Falen, talking about issues that apply to average, everyday people of the federal government against us. And they hold all the cards, or most of the cards. We'll find out more about that right here on KSFO. We're talking with my guest, Karen Budd-Falen, about the situation of property rights, not only in the West, anywhere. We're in the West, but we're not. A lot of people don't think of our area as being a cattle country. Well, yeah, it is. There's a lot of agriculture in our area, and this is the kind of thing we're talking about. In terms of the questions that Phil brought up, do you have anything that you want to add to that of what happened with the Sackett case? He said that they won, but they lost, essentially. Are you familiar with any of the details in that?
Yes. And in the Sackett case, the Sacketts were essentially fighting for what we are fighting for now.
Mm-hmm.
The Pacific Legal Foundation brought the Sackett case because the EPA had fined them $30,000 a day for this alleged wetland violation. And the EPA said, you can't complain, you just have to pay the fine. You cannot appeal or legally challenge the action we're bringing against you. And what the Supreme Court said was, no, the EPA cannot just automatically enforce this fine. These people have the right to go back and to challenge this fine. And so that's where they are now.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the Supreme Court gave them the right to challenge the humongous fine that the EPA was leveling against them, and they're working their way through that challenge now.
And that is essentially the issue that you're talking about and we're talking about today.
Yes. Do you have a right to go to court and challenge the decisions of a federal employee or the federal government?
Well,
that's what we're fighting for.
If the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Sacketts to pursue action against the EPA, couldn't they overturn the case that you were telling us about earlier of the rancher who lost half his ranch because of what happened?
The cases were procedurally different,
mm-hmm.
And so essentially Robbins is not in the same position. There was Robbins can individually appeal all those procedural actions. What Frank Robbins could not deal with is this pattern and practice. And so the court said, if Frank Robbins wants to appeal all 26 individual trespasses and the one criminal decision and the breaking into the lodge, he can do that individually. He can't lump them all together, though, and go to court based on a pattern of practice.
And, of course, he wouldn't have enough money to do them individually.
Nobody would.
Except
And
the Justice
so in the
Department.
Sackett case, that was only Sackett's had to deal with the one EPA fine, and so they were able. The Supreme Court said, yes, you can challenge this one case, and the Sacketts are now doing that.
Good.
And so the cases are just in a different procedural posture.
Oh boy!
But the bottom line is the same. Do we have the right to challenge the federal government? And the answer absolutely needs to be yes.
I would hope so. I think what you're doing is just absolutely terrific, and I hope this gets much more attention. I certainly will be talking about it more in my program, and as things proceed, we'll stay in touch. And if there's ever anything happening in this case or other cases that you're handling, because I know that you have a law practice and this is your specialty of dealing with cases like this, please feel free to let us know, because I want to talk about it. I mean, it does affect a lot of people. We have, as you well know, the situation down here. It was just in the paper just yesterday, as a matter of fact, of today, another piece of land, a ranch, a farm, as a matter of fact, is going to be turned over to the state, and it's going to be this, keep people off of it. It's going to be a coastal land monument, et cetera, et cetera. But what it really doing is taking property off of the tax rolls, getting rid of businesses that produce food and or other products, and making the cost of land for homes more expensive in areas. It's very popular in our area. They want everything to be a green belt. But somebody's going to foot the bill for that, and that's what we're facing. Is there any?
Well, I appreciate your interest, and I'll certainly be happy to keep you and your listeners informed of how we progress.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And then when we have the dates of those next hearings, I'd be interested in a follow-up from you. Will you be at those hearings in Washington when they have them?
Yes.
Okay, good enough. Well, we'll stay in touch at least for that. In the meantime, you have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and thank you for being with us today on KSFO.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. And, just think about it. And it's interesting that the caller, Phil, mentioned the Sackett case, and we did that with Pacific Legal. And that was the case where these people had this huge piece of land. I believe, if I remember correctly now, it was in New Mexico. And it was dry land. And, they came in and said, no, I don't think so. It's the wetlands. But they did that here, if you remember, a few years ago with some of the vineyards, with the fairy shrimp. Remember those little tiny creatures only come out when it rains and you've got puddles of water and then they come out of the ground? Well, the EPA sort of came in and said, well, no, that's a wetland, so that you can't have your vineyard there and you can't do that. That's what's the matter. They have rules in saying that you can't have any type of construction or any human footprint, if you will, within a certain number of feet from the banks of a stream. Well, if that stream happens to be running through your property, they're limiting your use of the land on both sides of both banks of the stream. But this is part of the plan to have the federal government control all the water in the United States. I'll never forget when, years ago, when I first learned that the United States Coast Guard had a base and office in Lake Tahoe. And I remember thinking, the Coast Guard in Lake Tahoe? Yes, as a matter of fact, that is the case. But the feds want to have control of, as they describe, all navigable waters in the country. Now, whether that's a little trickle of a stream or a creek on the back of your property or what have you, or if it's a river running through, or if it's the, rivers running through the ocean. They want to control all of that. And if they can control all of that, it's like the feds controlling all of the highways. If they decide to block the highways, you ain't going anywhere. If they decide to put that water off limits, you heard Ms. Budd-Falen talking about the fact that they have actually, when they got into a dispute with farmers or ranchers on their water rights, actually run pipes under the ground and siphoned off the water from your own wells. They've done that. You heard her say they've actually put up fences so that the cattle can't get to the creek to drink the water, which they've done for decades. It smacks of what when they had the government shut down and the feds, all of a sudden, out of nowhere. I mean, everybody's thinking government shutdown. Okay, Congress is going to shut down, and all these big buildings are going to be shut down. And what they did was put up blockades around federal monuments. And you can't park on the road to look up at Mount Rushmore. And you can't get to the open air monuments in Washington for World War II veterans. That's what they did. You didn't see Obama involved in that. You didn't see Harry Reid involved in that. You didn't see anybody on the Republican side. All of a sudden, the mechanism of the federal government just churned right on. And they started doing these things through the bureaucrats. These are the people that my guest was talking about. Those are the ones. Not your senator or your congressman or your secretary of what's-a. You're talking about Joe Schmo out there and whatever, who has a federal title, deciding that this is what he wants to do. And if he does it and you don't like it, right now you cannot sue him and or his employer, the federal government, which, by the way, you support with your taxes. We're talking about constitutional violations. This story is much bigger than I realized when I first started reading about it. I will keep up to date on this. I will keep an eye on this. My producer and I will check with Ms. Budd-Falen every so often to find out what's happening. She mentioned the first congressional hearing. As a matter of fact, we will try to contact the chairman of that one and see maybe we can have him on after the first of the year. I mean, everybody's going home for Christmas. Nobody's around. And that's part of the problem that everybody in this business faces. I mean, any reporter, any media person right now, the people you want to contact are not going to be available. But I'd like to get the chairman of that committee on, and then they will set up another date, which will be in, as she said, the end of January, early February, and then another one. She'll be there, and we'll keep up to date on it, because this will affect Californians. This will affect us. And if you are concerned, quite frankly, about the fact that housing is more expensive, and it is, you are going to be really surprised when you see how much more expensive it will be as they take over more. Remember, this Santa Cruz Dairy, they want to have it be, the Coast Dairy, 7,000 acres. They want it to be a state monument. That means it's not going to be used. Certainly not used as a dairy. Certainly not used for anything except really pretty country. It's off the tax rolls. You're paying for it. I'm Barbara Simpson, KSFO.